Russian offensive meet Ukraine's brick wall. That's what Putin must feel like his soldiers have run into as Russia's front line collapses against the Donetsk fortress belt. The big spring push that Putin had planned was supposed to topple that belt. Instead, the Russian offensive is imploding as the fortress belt shuts it down and turns the territory that Russia wants to capture into a death trap. Putin didn't see this coming, but now experts from the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, are predicting the total failure of Russia's 2026 plans. Those plans were simple: take the fortress belt in 2026. Russia's entire spring offensive is built around the collapse of the fortress belt, France 24 reports. This string of heavily defended cities is the key to taking the Donetsk region, which will in turn lead to the collapse of the Donbass, which Putin has been demanding that Ukraine cede since peace negotiations began between Ukraine and Russia. What Putin has always wanted to convey, both to the West and the Russian people, is that the fortress belt is vulnerable, that Ukraine is on the verge of collapse, and with the fall of that belt of cities, Russia would also get its hands on what former Vice Admiral of the US Navy Robert B. Murrett calls a veritable highway for any army that wanted to conduct operations further into Ukraine and beyond. The juice, then, is worth the spring squeeze for Russia. At least that was the Russian plan, but the fortress belt is no easy foe to topple. A collection of 4 large cities and many small settlements that run north to south along the H20 Konstantinivka-Slovyansk highway, the belt is approximately 50 kilometers or 31 miles long and was home to over 380,000 people before Putin invaded Ukraine. That gives you a sense of the size and scale of the task that lies before Russia's forces, as they have been commanded to topple that belt of cities by the end of 2026. The spring offensive was supposed to be the start of Russia's glorious path to success in Ukraine. Sure, the fortress belt has been a thorn in Putin's side even before Russia launched its full-scale invasion. Since the start of hostilities in 2014, which led to the illegal annexation of Crimea and caused disruption in the Donbass, Ukraine has been building up its defenses in the fortress belt. Over a decade of fortification has also translated into the same amount of time that Russia has failed to make a dent in that belt. But Russia needs the belt. It will be key to taking the last 30% or so of the Donetsk region that will allow Putin to put himself in a position where he could spin the obvious failure of his special military operation into some sort of success story. Nobody would buy that outside of Russia, but that doesn't matter to Putin. He has plans for the spring and he isn't going to move away from them. It doesn't matter that Russia has been fighting for over 20 months just to topple Chasiv Yar, which is a tiny settlement outside of the fortress belt, by the end of 2025. Somehow Russia's leader thought his troops would be able to turn such a grinding failure in these sorts of outskirts settlements into the complete destruction of far more powerful defenses in the fortress belt. All Russia would need was more manpower for the job, and Putin has provided it. But we're already starting to see that things aren't going according to the weak plan that Putin has created for the fortress belt. The 2026 spring offensive is off to a terrible start. The casualties are starting to mount even before Russia's forces get anywhere near the belt. Just a few days into the new operation, Russia's losses were already hovering around 10,000 soldiers killed or injured, the National Interest reports. Russia's campaign to topple the fortress belt is also a record breaker, but in the worst possible way. March 17th saw Russia lose 1,710 of its soldiers in a single day, which is the highest number seen at any point in 2026 so far. We'll put an emphasis on those last 2 words, so far. A lot worse is to come for Russia, as Putin's strategy has failed to evolve from his approach of throwing more cannon fodder at Ukraine's defenses. These early losses were already signs that the spring offensive was off to such a terrible start that the goal of collapsing the fortress belt seemed a long way off. Russian military bloggers and propagandists are already starting to turn against Putin, as you'll discover if you stick with us. But this is where things start to shift from serious to catastrophic for Putin and his fortress belt plans. These losses would at least be acceptable to somebody as callous and tactically inept as Putin if they were made in return for territorial gains along the fortress belt. But those gains are not happening. And ISW expert and Ukrainian military observer Konstantin Mashevets explains what we're really seeing on the ground. The ISW reports that Mashevets claims that Russia has deployed elements of its 3rd Combined Arms Army in its push against the Donetsk fortress belt. Right now, those soldiers are fighting against Ukraine near Zakitna and Kriva Luka, both of which lie east of Slovyansk, which is at the northern tip of the fortress belt. It hasn't been going well for Russia in that region. Though Putin's forces managed to make some minor strategic advances earlier in March, The offensive has stalled out as of March 29th, as Putin's patsies have failed to make any sort of push forward for the week up to the ISW's report. That means practically no real movement since March 22nd. It gets worse for Russia. In the Konstantinivka direction, which you may remember as the other end of the fortress belt, Russia has deployed its 3rd Army Corps and its 8th Combined Arms Army. They're doing even worse than the 3rd Combined Arms Army. While the 3rd at least managed to make some progress before running into the Ukrainian brick wall, the forces Putin deployed at the southern tip of the fortress belt haven't even managed that. They're somehow moving even slower than the 3rd Combined Arms Army, which leaves Putin in something of a pickle. The plan was to attack the fortress belt from both ends. That can't happen when the troops at one of those ends haven't even made it close to the positions that Russia needs them to be in. Russia is trying to do the only thing that it knows how to do to solve the fortress belt problem that it's currently grappling with. More manpower will lead to victory, Putin believes, even if that means that yet more of Russia's young men are crushed under Ukraine's defenses. Mashavet says in a March 29th Facebook post that Russia has already been forced to start pulling forces from what he calls its mobilization reserve in the occupied regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. These are soldiers who are likely supposed to have stayed in the occupied regions for far longer, perhaps to serve as reinforcements once breakthroughs have been made along the fortress belt, but they're already being sent into the fight, as are the Russian Volunteer Assault Corps. In other words, Russia is committing more soldiers than it intended in the early weeks of the spring offensive because it's losing more troops than it anticipated, and getting practically nothing in return for those losses. Coming back to the attack from both ends strategy, Putin wants to pull off a classic pincer move. Attack from 2 different flanks and you box the enemy in, forcing them to defend on both sides as you whittle away at their forces. It's a military strategy as old as war itself, and it's what Putin wants to achieve with the dual pushes in both the north and south of the fortress belt region. But in the south of the fortress belt, particularly around Liman and Konstantinivka, the advances that Putin expected to see haven't happened. Without those advances, the pincer can't be executed. That's left Putin with a tough choice to make. Does he rely on his already failing troops in the south of the fortress belt? That seems to be a bad idea, and they're the ones being whittled away in return for no progress. Or does Putin send some reinforcements from the 3rd Combined Arms Army that has at least achieved a modicum of success in the north, even though it's stalled out now? That's not a great option either. Every soldier that Putin sends from the north is a soldier who can't defend the positions that Russia has. Opportunities for Ukrainian counterattacks will arise. At the same time, weakening the 3rd Combined Arms Army means that its already faltering offensives either get weaker or can't happen at all, so no reversal of a week of no gains can come. This is what we mean when we say that the fortress belt has shut down Russia's offensive. The ISW says that the few advances that Russia has made could support operations in the Liman and Konstantinivka directions, but they're nowhere near enough to do that while allowing for a drive towards Sloviansk. Putin has to pick one or the other, and in both cases he's sending his soldiers into a death trap that has already resulted in the scale of Russia's losses skyrocketing during the first couple of weeks of the spring offensive. The fortress belt is supposed to fall to this approach, but that's looking increasingly unlikely, especially if the goal is for that belt to collapse in 2026. The spring offensive is already imploding, and if Putin has been paying attention, he might have been able to see this coming. Before we go deeper into that and reveal a crazy twist that makes all of this so much worse for Putin, this is a quick break to remind you that you are watching The Military Show. We give you the full picture, not just the headlines. If you're getting value from the channel, remember to subscribe so you stay ahead of the curve. Right now, Putin will be furious with his failing troops. But he should be even angrier with himself, because all of this was predicted months before Russia even started the spring offensive that was supposed to collapse the fortress belt by the end of 2026. Somehow, after over a decade of failing to take the fortress belt, Putin still hasn't realized that this isn't a task that his forces can complete in a little under a year. And again, it's the ISW, specifically 2 of its Russia researchers, Jenny Olmsted and Jessica Sobieski, who pointed this out back on December 18th. They noted that at the time, Russia was still in the midst of a 22-month campaign to seize Pokrovsk and Mirnorad. That alone should have been a hint to Putin that the much more fortified belt that he has in his sights will be far from an easy victory. As for when the fortress belt might fall, the duo claims that 2026 is ambitious at best. Russian forces are unlikely to seize all of Donetsk and the fortress belt any sooner than 2027 or 28, assuming Ukraine's international partners continue supporting Ukraine, the duo said in December. What we're now seeing during the early weeks of the spring offensive is that this prophecy is almost certain to come true. This isn't a failure all of Putin's making, as inept as he and his military commanders have proven themselves to be. Russia has spent much of the latter part of 2025 trying to prepare for its spring offensive. not just with the pushes in Pokrovsk and Mirnorad, but also by taking territory in Ukraine's south. The idea was to create a buffer zone in the southern region that would prevent Ukraine from funneling reserves to the southern tip of the fortress belt that Russia intended to attack. For a while, it even looked like Russia had been successful. However, the loss of access to the illicit Starlink terminals that Russia has been using for much of the war spelled doom for the southern position. Starting at the end of January, Ukraine has been conducting a counteroffensive in the south that has liberated as much as 400 square kilometers, or about 154 square miles of the territory that Russia occupied. Any buffer zone that Putin had hoped to create has been shattered. Now, Russia is also having to send reserves to Ukraine's south to try to push the counteroffensive back, which adds up to more soldiers intended for the fortress belt that aren't doing what Russia intended. Plus, with the buffer gone, Ukraine has carved a route through to the south of the fortress belt, which goes some way to explaining why Russia's forces in that region are failing so badly. RBC Ukraine notes that the soldiers being sent from Donetsk to Ukraine's south aren't your basic rank-and-file infantry. Elite units and paratroopers have been tasked with snatching the territory that Ukraine has liberated back. What does that leave Russia with during its spring offensive against the fortress belt? Meat. Cannon fodder. Soldiers with barely any training and even less strategic nous, who are just being sent to die against fortifications for which they are in no way prepared. There's a reason why Russia just broke its own record for casualties in a single day, and we're probably going to see that record get broken several times over before the spring is done. As Putin watches the fortress belt shut down every offensive that Russia launches, he'll be asking himself what went wrong. Ukraine, doing the unexpected in the south, played a part, and Putin is far too egotistical to believe that he could be anything less than a strategic genius, but he won't see the part he and his Kremlin cronies have played in all this. But behind the problems that Russia is experiencing on the battlefield lies an even bigger issue that Putin needs to get a handle on. Russia's military bloggers are turning against him. And one of them is among the most influential propagandists that Putin has in his Russia-based disinformation army. Little by little, the advantage is going to our enemies. Very experienced guys are working there. They are highly qualified specialists. They know how things work, and they are working to take advantage of the technical superiority they have, were the words of Yuri Podolyaka when assessing the offensive against the fortress belt so far. To understand why this particular propagandist is so important, you need to know who he is. Podolyaka was a former Ukrainian citizen who transferred his loyalty to Russia in 2014 amidst Putin's first campaign of aggression against Ukraine. That makes him the perfect type of propagandist for Putin. Who better than a former Ukrainian to tell Russia's people how justified Putin's invasion is? And for about 4 years, Podolyaka, who has 2.7 million YouTube subscribers and about 2.8 million followers on Telegram, was exactly what Putin wanted. A man who beat the propaganda drum to a massive audience right up until last winter, when he was still predicting the inevitable collapse of the Ukrainian military. But now, one of Russia's top military bloggers has turned against his paymaster, and the collapse of the spring offensive is the reason why. Still, vague comments about the superiority of Ukraine's technology and strategy may not seem like the biggest betrayal in the world. You could even argue that Podolyaka is trying to hedge his bets and getting good with the country that he betrayed years before. However, you haven't heard the words that this military blogger reserved for what he sees as the fate of the spring offensive. Unfortunately, I think that in the coming months, we will not be able to change this situation. We just can't, to our great misfortune, the propagandist declares. He adds that the main Russian effort should be coming against Ukraine right now, but it's difficult to see how that effort will succeed. Russia, Podolyaka says, will experience big losses as it tries to tackle the fortress belt. Ukraine's technological edge is too strong. It's starting to conduct attacks against the Russian rear in the occupied regions of Donbass, which has been made possible by Ukraine's new mid-range drones. Those drones are wiping out Russian air defenses as we speak, along with taking out key military nodes in the occupied regions. Podolyaka isn't the only one of Putin's former supporters to turn against the Russian president. Ilya Remyazlo, who for years has been an advocate of Russia dominating its neighbors, has also stabbed a knife into Putin's back. We all thought Putin was the unifier of Russian lands, and now we've come to this: bloody assaults, the luring of contract soldiers by deception, and much more, Remyazlo has declared. He calls Putin's invasion a dead-end war and says that it could go on for another decade, all to assuage the ego of a man who can't accept that he has failed to achieve any of his objectives. Bottom line, Vladimir Putin is not a legitimate president. Vladimir Putin must resign and be brought to trial as a war criminal and thief. Long live freedom, damn it, Remyazlo blares. These are people who have spent years towing the Kremlin line on the propaganda front. Now they're telling literally millions of people that Russia is failing and that Putin is a weak leader. This is the bigger problem for Putin, and it's going to be fed by what's happening in Ukraine right now. As more weeks pass with minimal gains, more losses, and no dents put into the fortress belt, Putin's strategic ineptitude is finally going to come back to haunt him. He'll try to silence the voices. By the end of 2025, the Kremlin was already cracking down on Russia's military bloggers, and Putin has since started taking steps to close the internet in Russia so that only state-approved and controlled sources will be accessible. That won't change the casualty count in Ukraine. It'll do nothing about the failed spring offensive. As Putin cracks down inside Russia, the voices against him will get even louder. As for the fortress belt, it will do what it's been doing since at least 2014, stand against Putin's aggression. What the Kremlin thought would take months is going to take years at best, and it's already costing Russia far more than it should. Russia's deadliest day of 2026 so far has already been and gone, and it's only going to get worse from here. We've already analyzed what happened to Russia on March 17th, as well as how poorly Putin's forces fared in the week, including that fateful day. If you want to learn more about what Ukraine has done to stop Russia's spring offensive in its tracks, check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure that you subscribe to The Military Show for more insight into what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. And thank you for watching.